And General Harwick said, "Cute call sign, sweetheart. Did your daddy pick it for you?" I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I stood in the center of that briefing room at Fort Bragg, surrounded by a dozen men who outranked me, and I said, "No, sir. The Taliban picked it." The room went quiet. He didn't laugh after that. My name is Lena Vasquez. I was 26 years old when I became the youngest female intelligence officer embedded with a special forces unit in eastern Afghanistan. I was 29 when I walked out of the Pentagon with a classified commendation no one was supposed to know about. And I was 31 when I sat across from a Senate subcommittee and watched the man who had tried to end my career, the man who had called me a liability in boots, get stripped of his stars in front of the entire United States military establishment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it actually started, not the part they put in reports, the part that happened to me. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. My mother worked the front desk at a medical clinic. My father drove freight trucks until his back gave out when I was 14, and after that he sat in our kitchen most mornings drinking black coffee and watching the news with a look on his face like the world owed him something it was never going to pay. I loved him. I want to be clear about that. I loved him even when he drank too much, even when he got loud, even when my mother would take me to my aunt's house and not say anything on the drive over. I enlisted in the army at 19 because I was good at languages. By the time I was 18, I spoke Spanish and Arabic in a passable Dari that I taught myself from library books and online forums. My high school counselor told me to go to community college. My ASB scores told a different story. The recruiter who signed me up called my Arabic exceptional. He said the army needed people like me. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't telling me everything, like the fact that when you're a young Latina woman who happens to be fluent in the languages the army desperately needs, certain people will use you and certain people will resent you for being used. And those two groups will find a way to make your life very complicated. My first deployment was to Bagram. I was an intelligence analyst, which meant I sat in a room and listened to intercepts and wrote reports that went up a chain of command I would never fully see. I was good at it. I was very good at it. By the end of my first year, I had flagged 3 separate communications that led to actionable intelligence, one of which disrupted a weapons transfer that would have armed a cell operating out of Kunar province. Nobody told me that last part directly. I pieced it together from fragments. That was something I got very good at, piecing things together from fragments. My commanding officer at the time was a lieutenant colonel named Walsh. He was fair, not warm, not effusive, but fair in the way that actually matters. He looked at results, not at what he expected to see. Under him, I was promoted to staff sergeant faster than anyone in my intake class. He put a commendation in my file. He wrote that I had, quote, an analytical instinct that most officers 3 grades above her would envy. Walsh rotated out in the spring of my second year, and General Harwick rotated in. The first time I met him, I was giving a briefing. There were 12 people in that room. I was the only woman. I was the only person under 30. I was also the person who had spent the last 4 months building a profile on a financier who was funneling money to 3 separate insurgent networks across 2 provinces. I had the slides, I had the intercepts, I had 6 weeks of pattern analysis laid out in a format that was clean and airtight. I had done this before, I knew what I was doing. Harwick walked in late. He sat at the head of the table, he looked at the slides, he looked at me, and then he looked at the major next to him and said, in a voice that carried clearly across the entire room, "Who is this?" The major told him. Harwick nodded slowly, the way men do when they're deciding whether or not to take you seriously, and they've already decided not to. He let me finish the briefing. When I was done, he said, "Good effort. The way you'd tell a child their drawing was nice." Then he turned to Captain Reyes, who was sitting to my right, and said, "Get me a senior analyst on this." I was the senior analyst. Reyes looked at the floor. I looked at Harwick. I said evenly. Sir, I am the senior analyst on this case. I've been running the source network for 4 months. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I understood in that moment that it wasn't about competence. He wasn't questioning my work. He had looked at me, my age, my face, the name on my uniform, and made a calculation that had nothing to do with the files in front of him. He said, "I'll have Captain Reyes review your findings." I said, "Yes, sir." I walked out of that briefing room. I went to the bathroom. I ran cold water over my wrists, which was something I'd started doing when I was 15 and my father got loud. And it still worked the same way. It brought me back into my body, back into the present tense, back to the part of my brain that thought instead of felt. Then I went back to my desk, and I kept working. That was who I was. That was what I did. Harwick reassigned the case to Reyes within 48 hours. Reyes was a good officer, decent instincts, but he hadn't built the network I'd built. He didn't have the relationships I had. He didn't speak Dari. Within 3 weeks, 2 of my sources went dark because someone in the chain changed the contact protocol without consulting me, and the financier we'd been tracking moved his operation across the border into Pakistan, where our reach was substantially more complicated. I wrote a memo. I documented everything, the timeline, the protocol change, the fallout. I sent it up through proper channels. It disappeared. I found out later that Harwick had flagged my file with a note that said I was difficult to integrate into a team environment, that I had boundary issues with authority, that I had, on multiple occasions, undermined the operational judgment of senior officers. This was his version of what had happened, his version which he had written into my record, which would follow me everywhere I went. I requested a transfer. It was denied. I requested a meeting with the Inspector General's office. That meeting was scheduled, then cancelled, then rescheduled, then cancelled again. The 3rd time I was told it was due to staffing constraints. The 4th time I was told there was no record of any previous scheduling. The 5th time I stopped requesting. I want to be honest with you, there is a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond tired. It's not about sleep. It's what happens when you've done everything right, followed every rule, used every legitimate channel, documented every single thing, and the system looks at you and says, "It's not that we don't see you, it's that we've decided not to." I know what some people are going to say, that I was young, that I didn't understand how institutions work, that you have to play the long game. I've heard all of it, and I want to be clear. I was 26 years old, doing the work of someone 10 years my senior, in a combat environment, with my name on intelligence that was saving American lives. I had earned the right to be seen. What I hadn't earned yet was what came next. My brother. I haven't mentioned my brother. His name was Marco. He was 3 years older than me, and he had joined the army before I did, on a different path. Infantry, which suited him in ways that intelligence work would never have. Marco was the kind of person who was funny without trying, who remembered the names of every person he'd ever met, who would give you his last $20 and genuinely not think about it again. He was also the best soldier I've ever known, and I have known a lot of soldiers. Marco was deployed to a firebase in Logar province in the late spring of the same year I was fighting my paper war with Harwick. I didn't see him often. We were in different sectors, different commands, but we emailed when we could, called when we could get a signal, sent each other stupid memes and grocery store photos from stateside friends who didn't understand why we found ordinary things funny. In June I got a call, one of those calls, the kind where the voice on the other end says your name first, says it carefully, and you already know before they say anything else. Marco's convoy had been hit. An IED on a road outside a village they'd cleared twice before. 3 soldiers were killed. Marco was one of them. I don't remember much of the next few hours. I remember the floor of my room. I remember someone bringing me water. I didn't drink. I remember calling my mother and hearing the sound she made. which is a sound I will spend the rest of my life trying to forget. I also remember 2 days later, when the fog started to lift, looking at my records and pulling every piece of intelligence I had ever generated about that road, about that village, about the networks operating in that area. And I found something. 6 weeks before Marco's convoy was hit, I had filed a report flagging unusual movement patterns on that route. I had noted a possible IED placement risk based on 3 separate source reports. I had requested an updated route assessment for all convoys operating in that sector. The report had been reviewed by one person before it was shelved. His name was on it. Harwick. He had marked it low priority, insufficient source corroboration and moved on. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be very careful here about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. War is complicated. Intelligence is imperfect. Decisions made in the field are made with incomplete information under conditions that people sitting safely in offices later and cannot fully reconstruct. I know all of this. I have lived all of this. What I'm saying is that I had done my job. I had filed the report. I had used the system exactly as it was designed to be used. And Harwick had dismissed my work, not because of the substance of it, but because of his opinion of me. Because I was difficult to integrate, because I had boundary issues with authority, because when he walked into a briefing room and saw a 26-year-old woman presenting intelligence analysis, his first response was to ask who she was. I'm not saying he intended what happened. I'm saying intention is sometimes less relevant than we think. I requested another transfer. This time, I didn't go through Harwick's chain. I went sideways through a contact I had made at DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, who had seen my work and knew its value. She was a civilian, a senior analyst with 20 years in the building, and she had a kind of quiet, implacable authority that made things happen in ways that didn't show up on org charts. Her name was Vivian, not my Vivian, not the name from any list, but the version of Vivian that exists in the world of women who have spent decades being underestimated and have converted that underestimation into a very precise form of power. I will call her V. V made some calls. My transfer came through in 3 weeks. I spent the next 2 years at DIA, and they were, professionally, the best 2 years of my career. I had analysts around me who spoke my language. I had cases that challenged me in ways that felt meaningful rather than obstructive. I had a supervisor who read my work and called me into his office not to question it, but to ask me questions about it. Real questions, the kind you ask when you're genuinely trying to understand. I also spent those 2 years building something I had not set out to build, a documented record of everything that had happened, not for anything in particular, not with any plan in mind, just because I had spent enough time working in intelligence to know that documentation is the only thing that survives everything else. I had the timeline. I had the report I'd filed about that road. I had Harwick's notation. I had the date his notation was entered. I had the date Marco's convoy was hit. I had the record of my previous complaints and the records of their non-processing. I had the commendation Walsh had written before Harwick arrived. I had Harwick's subsequent note about my boundary issues. I had all of it. And then in my second year at DIA, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Harwick was nominated for a 4th star. He was going to be promoted to full general. The nomination went to the Senate Armed Services Committee for confirmation. It was expected to be routine. Harwick had 40 years of service, a wall full of decorations, and the kind of biography that reads well in prepared remarks. What he didn't have was any expectation that anyone was going to show up and say anything. Bea called me the day the nomination was announced. She didn't say, "Are you going to do something about this?" She didn't say anything melodramatic. She said, "I think you should talk to someone on the oversight staff. I know someone who will listen." I said, "I think so too." I'm not going to pretend I wasn't afraid. I was. The thing people don't tell you about coming forward with anything in a military context is that the institution has a very long memory and a very limited tolerance for what it calls outside interference, which is its term for accountability that originates from outside its own chain of command. I had a good career going, I had a security clearance I cared about, I had a future in this work. But I also had that report, and I had Marco. I met with the oversight staff member V had recommended. His name was Daniel Cho, a slight man in his 40s with reading glasses he kept taking on and off, and the legal pad that was already half full when I arrived. He listened, he asked questions, he did not perform empathy, he just paid attention and was more useful. I gave him everything. The documentation, the timeline, the report, Harwick's notation, the complaint history, the transfer denial. I also gave him something I hadn't originally included, a pattern analysis I had run on Harwick's record of intelligence evaluations during the period he supervised me. It showed a statistically significant correlation between reports generated by female analysts and reports rated low priority or insufficient corroboration. I hadn't built that analysis to be vindictive. I had built it because it was what I did. I looked at data and I found patterns. Daniel Cho looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at me and said, "Do you understand what you're giving me?" I said, "I hope so." The confirmation hearing was 3 months later. I was not a public witness. The subcommittee process allowed for classified testimony in closed session, which was the appropriate setting for most of what I had to say. I sat in a room with 6 senators and their staff, and I answered questions for 4 hours. I was not emotional. I was precise. I said what I knew, and I said when I wasn't certain, and I did not editorialize beyond what the evidence supported. The hearing became public. Eventually, in the way that Washington things do, carefully, in pieces, through sources who spoke on condition of anonymity. The story that emerged was not my story specifically. It was a pattern story, a question of whether the Army's internal review processes for flagged intelligence had functioned as designed, and whether there were systemic issues with how certain categories of analysts were treated within certain command structures. Harwick's nomination was placed on hold pending a review. The review took 4 months. I won't walk you through all of it because I was not present for most of it and because some of it is still classified. What I can tell you is that at the end of those 4 months, General Harwick requested early retirement. He did not get his 4th star. I found out on a Tuesday morning. V called me. She said, "Have you seen the news?" I said, "I'm looking at it." She said, "How are you feeling?" I was quiet for a moment. Outside my apartment window in Alexandria, Virginia, the trees were doing that early spring thing where they just started to leaf out and the light comes through them differently, softer and more complicated at the same time. I had a cup of coffee going cold on my desk. I had the news open on my laptop. I thought about Harwick walking into that briefing room. I thought about him saying, in that carrying voice, "Who is this?" I thought about the notation on my report. I thought about the road in Logar province. I thought about Marco. I said to V, "I don't know yet, ask me in a few months." She understood that. The aftermath of things like this is never clean in the way you imagine it might be when you're in the middle of them. There's no ceremony, nobody comes to your door with a formal apology and a handshake. The institution doesn't say you were right, it adjusts quietly in ways you might or might not ever be able to trace, and then it moves forward, because institutions always move forward, that's what they're built to do. What I got, instead of ceremony, was a call from a woman I had never met, a general at Pacific Command. The first female 4-star in her branch, who had read whatever version of the story had made its way to her level. She called me directly. She said she understood I had shown exceptional integrity under considerable institutional pressure. She said she had a position on her staff that she thought I might be suited for. She said she would be glad to have me if I was interested. I asked her what the role involved. She described it. It was demanding. It was complex. It was exactly the kind of work I'd spent my career preparing for. I said, "I'm interested." She said, "Good. There's one more thing I want to tell you." I waited. She said, "My staff has a tradition of call signs. It's informal, don't read too much into it. But the analyst who was in this role before you had one. I'd like to ask if you're comfortable with yours." I didn't know what she meant. I said, "What is it?" She said, "We've been calling the position ghost signal. The analyst who holds it is the one who finds what everyone else missed, who speaks up when the room goes quiet. That's the work. Does that suit you?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Yes, that suits me." I started on a Monday in April. The trees in the Pacific Northwest were doing something entirely different from the trees in Alexandria. Bigger, more serious, the kind of trees that have been there long enough to have opinions. My new office had a window. I had 3 direct reports who were all in various ways excellent. My supervisor was a 2-star who had read every file I'd ever generated before my first day and treated me from the beginning exactly as those files warranted. On my 3rd week, I sat in a briefing room, a different briefing room in a different part of the world with different people at the table, and I presented an analysis I had built over the previous 2 weeks. When I finished, the room was quiet in a different way than rooms had been quiet around me before. It was the quiet of people thinking. The general said, "Good work, Vasquez." Not good effort. Good work. It shouldn't matter. I know it shouldn't matter. It's 2 words from a person in a room, but after everything, after all the years and the reports and the memos and the calls and the notation on the file and the road in Logar province, after all of it, 2 words from a person who meant them landed differently than I expected. I drove home that night on roads I was still learning, through neighborhoods I was still mapping in my mind, and I thought about my mother at her desk in the clinic in Tucson, checking people in and out, being kind to people who were scared, doing her job the way she always had. I thought about my father in the kitchen with his coffee. I thought about Marco. The last time I saw him in person, at Christmas 2 years before he deployed, eating my aunt's tamales and laughing about something I can't remember now and not thinking at all about what was coming, neither of us thinking about it, just being there. I pulled into my driveway and I sat in the car for a minute before I went inside. I had done what I could with what I had. I had told the truth when telling it was costly. I had kept the documentation when part of me wanted to throw it all away and just move on. I had trusted that there was a version of the system that worked, and I had gone looking for it, and I had found it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to matter. Marco was still gone, that part doesn't change. But I was still here, and I was doing the work. That, in the end, is the only version of justice that I have found to be real. Not restoration, not reversal, not the moment when the person who wronged you is finally seen for what they are, though that moment came, and it did mean something. The real version is simpler and harder, and it doesn't end. It's getting up in the morning and doing your job better than anyone expected you to. It's putting your name on your work and letting your work speak. It's the quiet in the room when you finish saying what you have to say and everyone knows without you having to tell them exactly who you are. I think about General Harwick sometimes. Not with anger anymore, that passed. I think about him the way you think about a lesson that cost more than it should have. He was not a stupid man. He had 40 years of service and a wall full of decorations and the kind of confidence that institutions build in people when they reward them long enough without ever asking them to be wrong. That confidence became the thing that undid him. Not me, not the subcommittee, not the review, himself. The version of himself that walked into a briefing room, looked at a 26-year-old woman doing the best analytical work of anyone in that command, and decided in about 4 seconds that she didn't count. That's what I mean when I say the cause and the consequence were the same thing. He dismissed my report on that road because he had dismissed me, and every outcome that followed, For him, for me, for Marco, flowed directly from that single failure of judgment, not fate, not luck. A choice made in a moment that he probably didn't even recognize as a choice. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually protected me through all of it. It wasn't talent alone. I knew other talented people who got ground down and walked away. It wasn't luck. What protected me was something closer to character, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It's doing the work right when no one is watching. Filing the report even when you have no reason to believe it'll be read. Keeping the documentation when part of you wants to burn it all and just move on. Those aren't dramatic acts. They don't feel meaningful in the moment. But they compound, the way interest compounds, quietly over time into something that holds. What I learned from Harwick, or maybe what Marco's death taught me, though I resist the framing that his life was a lesson for mine, is that intelligence without integrity is just cleverness, and cleverness without direction will eventually find a way to collapse on itself. I was good at my job, but being good at my job wasn't enough. I had to be honest about what I found even when honesty was the harder path. I had to trust the evidence over my own discomfort. That's the part they don't teach you in training. Not the analytical methods, but the willingness to say clearly what the data shows even when the room doesn't want to hear it. And the third thing, the one that took me longest to understand, is that endurance isn't stubbornness. There were 100 moments when I could have quit and been reasonable for doing so. The difference between quitting and staying wasn't that I was braver than other people. It was that I had decided, somewhere along the way, that the work mattered more than my comfort, that the truth on that report mattered more than whether anyone read it. You can't sustain that kind of persistence from willpower alone. It has to come from somewhere deeper, from the part of you that knows, even when the institution says otherwise, that what you're doing is right. I drive past the base sometimes, on roads I know better now than I did when I arrived. The trees are bigger in summer than I expected. My office has a window that catches the afternoon light. My name is on work that is doing what it's supposed to do. Marco isn't here to see it. That's the part that doesn't resolve. But I am here and I am doing the work, and I have to think, that is not nothing.